towards the end of last week, rioting broke out in the Harehills suburb of Leeds. It essentially seems to start with a row between a Roma family and social services. Eventually, the police were called, but they were pelted with missiles. They retreated. The police car they left was flipped over and attacked. Buses were set on fire. Delivery vans were set on fire. Thousands of people took to the streets. Paul, I mean, am I being too bleak in thinking that these kinds of scenes have become increasingly inevitable, or we're becoming inured to them a little bit?
We've always had riots in this country. I remember growing up in the 80s. There were riots in places like Handsworth in Birmingham and Tottenham and Brixton and places like that. But what kind of strikes me about certainly the one in Leeds is some of those other riots, not that I'm a kind of supporter of rioting, but some of those other riots, you kind of sense that people had genuine political grievances. You know, there was a stop and search in Brixton. There was alleged police harassment in Handsworth and Tottenham and places like that, and unemployment in Toxteth, and that people felt that kind of searing sense of grievance to the degree where they thought we want to go and take to the streets and smash a few windows, burn a few cars and whatever. Whereas I know ostensibly this one in Leeds was about, you know, children being removed from the family, but given that there were hundreds, possibly thousands of people who at some point attended those riots and took part in those riots, I can't imagine that all of them felt a deep sense of political grievance. I suspect most of them probably didn't even know the facts around it, probably didn't even know the family. And when you see some of the footage of it, what struck me was a lot of it just seems to be purely gratuitous. Lots of giggling, lots of kids kind of involved, a couple of women involved as well, and people filming it on their smartphones. And that was, I found that disturbing, because there was almost, for many people, there was not even a cause to be there in the first place. So I detected a kind of cultural shift in that regard. And you asked in your question also the issue about the police. I think there are serious questions for the police as well, because it did seem, I think they've kind of pretty much admitted this as well, that they withdrew entirely from the area and actually weren't seen again until about, I think, 4 or 5 hours later. And you think, and again, you know, recalling my childhood, I remember the scenes of riots in Toxteth and whatever, and just seeing the police with their riot shields and their batons and their riot helmets and taking the bricks and whatever and moving forward and being pushed back. Whereas what seems to be the way now, and I'm happy to be corrected by any police officers watching, but what seems to be the way now is, oh, this looks a bit nasty, we'll just withdraw because we're probably the cause of it, and we'll let them burn the place out, and we'll go in a few hours later and kind of help with the clear up, and then we'll rely on camera phone footage to arrest people sort of later in the week if we can. I find that really disturbing, because you heard accounts from people on the scene saying we were left to our own devices, basically. The place was in flames. They were setting light to cars and flipping over police cars, and they were setting light to buses and anything else they can get their hands on. And the police were nowhere to be seen. And actually, when you look at the footage, you can see some daytime footage, because I think it started around about 5 o'clock in the evening, and then nighttime footage. And in most of the footage I saw, there were just no police. You didn't kind of hear sirens in the background approaching. It was just literally the citizens themselves. So I think there are, you know, it was a really disturbing episode, and I think serious questions for the police. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and it's interesting because obviously you can understand why they had to retreat in the first place, probably outnumbered. But get back in pretty quickly. Exactly. Yeah. It took many hours. And Ella, I mean, I think, does it raise questions about integration? That, you know, we're talking about an area of Leeds that is extremely ethnically and culturally diverse. I think over 80 nationalities represented there. It feels like one of those places that is almost, you know, not integrated into wider British society. I mean, that came across from me from the suspicion of the social workers, for instance. Yeah. From the suspicion towards the social workers, I should say, sorry.
I think the response to this also contains a lesson within it, because there were some pretty ugly knee-jerk responses on social media from the usual types who had probably not seen many Roman gypsies before and assumed that this was a Muslim community, and the usual crap went out about integration. And the reason why that's so bad, other than being sort of, in many cases, blatantly racist, was that there is a serious discussion to be had about the idea of diverse but divided communities, and a lot of hostility to not just authorities, but sort of normal ways of life. And obviously that might be particularly acute among the Roma community for various cultural reasons for them. But it was interesting to, as Paul said, watching some of the footage, to note that there were these counsellors getting involved. One of them was a Muslim counsellor who was, sweat pouring off him, trying to throw buckets of water on one of these buses, asking, I don't know where the police are, and that kind of thing. And there is just this, I think there's this sort of paradox, which is that there is a sort of a state overreach into the idea of multiculturalism, and there's a big focus on the idea that everybody will get along, and there's no sort of authenticity in community integration anymore. Everybody's very nervous about each other because we're told constantly not to be racist, not to, step out of line. And yet the actual sort of mechanisms of how a community runs are absent. So, people in authority, whether it's the fire service or the police or whatever, being absent in events like that, no one taking a lead, and neighbours having to fend for themselves, is the kind of thing that does breed resentment and that does hamper any sort of sense of social integration. I also think that, we have to face up to the issue, which is that we're unable to defend what it might mean to be a citizen of Leeds as well as a citizen of the country at large. We're unable, we've many times on this podcast talked about and written about on Spiked the issue of a sense of national identity, and unpicking how you talk about that without going down a sort of superficial flag obsessed sort of patriotic route in the kind of nonsense way that it's talked about, but really thinking, what values do we hold? What do we think is right and wrong? And how can we inculcate that in, people who are born here and people who come here and all the rest of it? And I think that the sort of febrile atmosphere that an event like Leeds reveals is a barrier to that kind of integration, but it's just a symptom of a larger failing. This isn't happening for no reason. It's not just that this group of Romas decided we're going to riot tonight. There is a big bubbling tensions happening. I mean, it happened in Leicester to a whole different community for a whole different set of reasons, but the underlying causes are the same. There's a feeling of a sort of there's no cohering factors or genuine community. And I think that's a problem. If you don't have a shared identity, you don't have shared responsibilities. Yeah. And I think it's, the irony is that, the British state actually is promoting these kinds of divisions through, promoting an atomized society through multiculturalism. The Leeds City Council put out a statement celebrating the diversity of the Roma community on that very evening, which is such an odd thing to celebrate. And it's just defensive. It just comes across as incredibly defensive and makes people more annoyed. Yeah, when really, you want people to integrate. You want people to see value in their nation, value in their own community. So they're not, let's not forget, people are attacking their own community more than they were attacking the authorities or the powers that be in a situation like this. I mean, Paul, do you think multiculturalism is playing a role in a lot of this?
I think two things. I think first of all, the complete lack of control over numbers, in terms of numbers coming into the country, contributes to some of this fragmentation and atomization that you talk about. I've always said I'm pro-immigration, but like all good things, it needs to be regulated properly, and it needs to be done in moderation. And when you have such a lack of control over numbers, it does make integration harder by definition. It reduces, if you like, any incentive on people to integrate. If you get these communities, paradoxically, these monocultural communities kind of living in silos in what we are told is actually a multicultural country. So I think that the question of numbers is an important one, and we can't avoid that. And also the whole kind of ideology of state-sponsored multiculturalism, which for me has always been about what I call the active promotion of separateness and difference, of actually trying to reinforce to people the whole time, look, you are so different from everybody else in this country, and you've got to celebrate your separateness the whole time. And to kind of draw these distinctions and to promote these distinctions between people, and to say how we should all celebrate those differences, seems to me to have had the opposite effects of that intended. It has actually driven communities apart, where they do actually feel pretty different, and they don't particularly feel integrated, and they don't necessarily share those common cultural bonds and that shared national identity. And those of us who argue that are always told, oh no, you're bigoted, and multiculturalism is the enlightened way. And I always just want to respond by saying to people, well, look at somewhere like Japan, which doesn't obsess about promoting multiculturalism at every opportunity, is proud to be Japan, and is very highly civilized and law governed and fairly stable and free and peaceful society. No one would seriously say that Japan is some sort of dystopian nightmare because it doesn't obsess about multiculturalism. I think it is possible for a country to say, look, actually we've got a long established culture, and that's the one that we're going to promote. We absolutely defend your right in terms of freedom of worship and to eat the food you want, the clothes you want to wear. That's absolutely your call. But from a public policy point of view, we're going to defend what is the long-established culture of this country. And, you're very free to come and join with us and share in it. We've been terrible. We've been terrible at this through frankly, cowardly politicians, I think, for so long. And socially and culturally, I think we're paying a huge price for it. And it's spilling out in places like Harehills and Leeds and elsewhere.
Definitely.